Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your stories inspire us. Now let's dive into today's captivating tale. James Walker lived what many would call the American dream. A senior architect at one of New York's top firms, he had the kind of career others envied. His designs adorned the skyline, each structure standing as a testament to his creativity and relentless drive. At home, life seemed equally picture-perfect. His wife, Emily, was the epitome of grace and warmth. Together, they occupied a charming townhouse in Brooklyn, complete with a small garden Emily loved to tend. Their friends often joked they were the couple everyone aspired to be. But beneath the polished surface, James felt a growing unease. It wasn't always like this. He remembered the days when Emily's laughter filled the house, when her touch felt like a promise of forever. Yet lately something was amiss. She had grown distant, her gaze often drifting somewhere beyond the present moment. He tried to dismiss it as work stress. After all, Emily managed a bustling events company. But the doubts lingered, clawing at the back of his mind. One evening, as James sat at his desk reviewing blueprints, Emily's phone buzzed on the counter. She was in the shower, so he thought little of it, until he noticed the name on the screen. Unknown number. He stared at it, his gut twisting. She always joked about having no secrets between them, yet she'd been unusually protective of her phone lately. Don't overthink it, James muttered to himself, but the thought stuck like a thorn. Why would she have unknown numbers calling late at night? He brushed the thought aside, trying to focus on work, yet his mind wandered back to recent oddities. Her sudden late-night outings, the subtle yet distinct smell of a cologne that wasn't his when she hugged him goodbye. James shook his head. Maybe it's nothing, he reassured himself. But the doubt had already taken root, and no amount of reasoning could pull it out. The world that had once seemed so certain, so solid, now felt riddled with cracks. Later that night, as they lay in bed, James glanced at Emily. She was scrolling through her phone, her face lit by the soft glow of the screen. He wanted to ask about the call, to air his suspicions, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he forced a smile. Busy day tomorrow? She nodded without looking up. Yeah, lots to handle. Her vague response gnawed at him. He turned away, staring at the ceiling. He was a man who thrived on details, on understanding every angle, but now he found himself lost in the shadows of ambiguity. As sleep eluded him, James's thoughts churned. What if his perfect life wasn't so perfect after all? What if the cracks he sensed were the beginning of something much worse? He knew he needed answers, but the question was, how far was he willing to go to find them? James's pulse quickened as Emily slipped her phone into the drawer before turning off the light. That small, seemingly insignificant action felt like confirmation. Something was off, terribly off. And for the first time in their marriage, James doubted the truth of the world they'd built together. The clock ticked past midnight in the Walker household, the soft hum of the heater the only sound in the otherwise silent room. James sat on the living room couch, nursing a glass of bourbon. He couldn't sleep, his mind wouldn't let him. His wife, Emily, had gone to bed hours ago, claiming she was exhausted after a long day. But James's instincts told him otherwise. Something about her behavior was too perfect, too polished, like a rehearsed play hiding an inconvenient truth. As he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the faint vibration of Emily's phone echoed from the kitchen counter. James's heart froze. He placed the glass down quietly and turned his gaze toward the source of the sound. The phone screen glowed faintly, illuminating the sleek countertop in the otherwise dim room. Another call. He moved quickly but silently, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The caller ID flashed, unknown number. His jaw tightened, and he felt a cold rush of anger and suspicion course through him. This wasn't the first time. Over the past few weeks, he'd noticed an increase in these calls. Always late at night, always dismissed by Emily with vague excuses. James picked up the phone, his fingers trembling with a mix of adrenaline and rage. He stared at it for a moment, debating whether to answer. This was his wife, the woman he trusted with his life. But trust wasn't a given anymore. It was a fragile, cracking foundation beneath his feet. With a deep breath, he swiped to answer, holding the phone to his ear without saying a word. Hey babe, a man's voice whispered on the other end, smooth and confident. James's stomach churned as the caller continued. You up? I was thinking about earlier. The way you... James didn't let him finish. He slammed the phone down onto the counter, his knuckles white as his hand gripped the edge of the granite surface. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as he stared at the device, as though it were some poisonous creature. The voice was unfamiliar, but the tone was unmistakable, intimate, suggestive, and brazen. He clenched his fists, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? Was Emily really capable of betraying him like this? The answers didn't matter right now. What mattered was confronting the truth head-on. James wasn't the kind of man to wallow in self-pity or let his emotions cripple him. He was a strategist, a man of action, and if there was one thing he hated more than betrayal, it was being played for a fool. He stormed upstairs, his pulse pounding in his ears. Pushing open the bedroom door, he found Emily sleeping soundly, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The sight filled him with a complicated mix of rage and heartbreak. He stood there for a moment, watching her, as though trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the stranger she'd become. James's voice was low but firm. "Emily, wake up." She stirred, groggy and disoriented. "What's wrong?" she murmured, rubbing her eyes. He held up her phone, the screen still displaying the recent call. "Who's this?" Her expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded, her eyes darting away from his. I don't know. Probably a wrong number." "Don't lie to me," James said, his tone steely. He wasn't yelling, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice that made Emily sit up straighter. "It's nothing," she said too quickly. "You're overreacting." "Am I?" He stepped closer, his gaze piercing. Because the man on the other end of this call didn't sound like nothing. He sounded like someone very familiar with you. Emily's face paled, and for a moment, James thought she might come clean. But instead, she crossed her arms defensively. "Why are you going through my phone? Don't you trust me?" James laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Trust? You want to talk about trust when you're sneaking around behind my back? You're being paranoid," she snapped, her tone icy now. "Maybe you should look at yourself before accusing me of things I haven't done." Her deflection only fueled his anger. "Don't play games with me, Emily. I've seen the late-night calls, the sudden outings, the lies. If you think I'm just going to sit here and let you insult my intelligence, you're sorely mistaken." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but James cut her off. "I'm going to find out the truth," he said, his voice low and resolute. "And when I do, you're going to wish you'd been honest with me." He left the room before she could say another word, slamming the door behind him. He didn't care if she was upset or angry. His focus was on uncovering the full extent of her betrayal. James wasn't a man to let emotions cloud his judgment. He was methodical, calculating, and determined to protect what was his, even if it meant confronting an ugly truth. Sitting back down on the couch, James began piecing together the clues he'd ignored for too long. The perfume that wasn't hers. The sudden, uncharacteristic interest in going out with friends she never named. The way she avoided his touch when she came home late, claiming exhaustion. He stared at the phone again, his mind racing. He wouldn't confront her with nothing but suspicion. He needed proof, undeniable evidence that left no room for excuses. And once he had it, he wouldn't just confront her. He'd destroy every illusion she'd built, just like she had destroyed his trust. As he sat in the dimly lit room, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He would follow the trail no matter how painful it was. Emily might have thought she was clever, but James was always one step ahead. He wasn't just a husband, he was a strategist. And if this betrayal was real, she would learn just how ruthless he could be. James's grip tightened around the phone as he scrolled through Emily's call logs and messages. The truth was buried in there somewhere, and he was determined to dig it out. The image of their perfect life was already shattered. Now it was time to uncover just how deep the cracks went. James's morning began earlier than usual. He didn't sleep much after the confrontation with Emily the night before, but instead of wallowing in uncertainty, he took action. As the sunlight crept through the blinds, he stared at his laptop screen, typing in search terms that might lead him to answers. He knew he couldn't rely on Emily to tell the truth. She had made that clear by trying to shift the blame onto him. If he wanted answers, he would have to find them himself. Emily moved through the house as if nothing had happened, humming to herself as she made coffee. James watched her from the corner of his eye, his jaw clenched. She had perfected the role of the doting wife, but the facade only infuriated him more. How dare she carry on as though she wasn't tearing their marriage apart? As she kissed his cheek before heading out to work, James remained stone-faced, his mind already on the next steps. The call from the previous night echoed in his memory, and he replayed the man's words over and over. He needed something concrete, and he knew exactly where to start. Later that afternoon, James found himself knocking on his neighbor Karen's door. Karen was a single mother in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and nosy by nature. If anyone in the neighborhood had noticed something out of the ordinary, it would be her. "James. What a surprise," Karen said, opening the door with a warm smile. "What can I do for you?" "I need to ask you something," James said, cutting straight to the point. His tone was firm but calm, his eyes unwavering. "Have you noticed anything unusual about Emily lately? Maybe people coming to the house when I'm not home, or her meeting someone nearby?" Karen's smile faltered and she hesitated. "Well, I don't like to meddle, but since you're asking," she glanced around, lowering her voice. "I've seen her a few times with a man. Tall, dark hair, drives a black BMW. They usually meet down the street and leave together. I thought it might be work-related, but—" Karen trailed off, her eyes scanning James's face for a reaction. He nodded, his jaw tightening. "Thank you, Karen. That's all I needed to know." As he walked away, Karen called out, "James, if you need anything, just let me know, okay?" He didn't reply. His mind was already racing. A black BMW. A man. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He felt the familiar rush of determination, the kind that had driven him to succeed in his career and personal life. If Emily thought she could keep this hidden, she was dead wrong. That evening, James confronted Emily again, this time armed with Karen's information. She had just walked in the door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor, when James stepped out of the shadows, his expression cold and unyielding. "Who's the guy with the black BMW?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made Emily freeze in her tracks. She blinked, her face pale. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me, Emily," James said, stepping closer. "Karen saw you meeting him. You've been sneaking around with him, haven't you?" Emily's lips parted, but no words came out. For a moment, she looked genuinely terrified, and James felt a flicker of satisfaction. Good. She should be scared. She had underestimated him, and now she was cornered. "James, it's not what you think," she finally said, her voice trembling. "He's just a friend. We've been working on a project together." "Don't insult me with that bullshit," James snapped, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Friends don't call each other babe in the middle of the night. They don't sneak around behind their spouses' backs." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but James didn't back down. He wasn't about to let her manipulate him with crocodile tears. "Tell me the truth," he demanded. "Who is he, and how long has this been going on?" She hesitated, then finally broke down. "His name is Alex," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've been seeing each other for a few months." James felt a surge of anger, but he kept his composure. "Why?" he asked, his voice cold and detached. "Was I not enough for you? Or was this just some game to you?" Emily looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "I don't know," she said. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." James laughed bitterly. "You didn't mean for it to go this far? You made a choice, Emily. Every time you answered his calls, every time you met him, you chose to betray me." She started to say something, but James held up a hand, silencing her. "Save it. I'm done listening to your excuses. If you think I'm just going to sit here and let you destroy my life, you're wrong. I'm not some weak, spineless man who's going to cry in a corner while you play the victim. You've made your bed and now you're going to lie in it?" Emily stared at him, her face a mix of guilt and fear. James turned and walked away, his mind already on what he needed to do next. He wasn't just going to confront the truth, he was going to expose it. And when he was done, Emily and her lover would regret ever thinking they could get away with this. That night, James sat at his computer pulling up records, tracking down details. He found Alex's social media profiles, his business connections, and even his home address. The man was a real estate developer, successful but with a reputation for being ruthless and cutthroat. Perfect, James thought. The higher they climb, the harder they fall. As he sifted through Alex's posts, James noticed a pattern. Photos of lavish parties, expensive cars, and women, none of whom looked like Emily. It seemed Alex was the kind of man who collected conquests, using women to boost his ego before discarding them. James's lip curled in disgust. Emily had risked everything for a man like this? But James wasn't just disgusted, he was motivated. He wasn't going to let Alex walk away unscathed. The man had intruded on his life, his marriage, and his dignity. And now James would make sure he paid the price. As James compiled his findings, a plan began to form in his mind. It wasn't enough to confront Emily and Alex. He wanted more than closure, he wanted justice. And by the time he was done, they would both understand the cost of betrayal. James wasn't a man to sit idly by and let life happen to him. After Emily's reluctant confession and the painful confirmation of her betrayal, he knew he couldn't rely on just what she had admitted. It wasn't enough. Her words were fragmented, incomplete, and likely sanitized to save face. But James needed the whole truth, the ugly, unvarnished reality. If he was going to take control of the situation and exact the justice he sought, he had to be thorough. The next morning, James made a call to his old friend, Richard Lawson, a private investigator with a knack for digging up dirt where others couldn't. Richard had served in law enforcement before transitioning to private work, and his reputation was impeccable. "Rich, I need your help," James said when the call connected. "James? What's going on, man? You sound serious." "I am. My wife's been cheating on me, and I need every detail about the man she's been seeing. His name is Alex. Real estate guy. Drives a black BMW. I want to know everything, where he goes, who he talks to, and what skeletons he's hiding." Richard was silent for a moment, then spoke. "This is heavy, James. Are you sure you're ready for what I might find?" "I'm ready," James said without hesitation. "I'm not looking for closure. I'm looking for justice." Richard agreed to take the case, promising to start immediately. James felt a flicker of relief. He trusted Richard to handle this, and knowing someone competent was on the trail gave him the focus he needed to plan his next move. That evening, James went through Emily's phone again. This time he wasn't just looking at call logs, he dug deeper. Old messages, deleted conversations, anything that might shed light on the extent of her betrayal. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. Buried in her recently deleted messages were fragments of conversations with Alex, plans to meet, flirtatious banter, and, most damningly, photos of them together. The sight of her in another man's arms made James's blood boil, but he didn't let the anger consume him. Instead, he saved everything, screenshots, images, and timestamps. He was building his case one piece at a time. A few days later, Richard called with his findings. "James, you're not going to believe this. Alex isn't just some smooth-talking playboy. He's dirty, really dirty. He's been involved in several shady real estate deals, some of which border on fraud. He's also been linked to a couple of lawsuits involving harassment. The guy's a walking scandal." James's grip on the phone tightened. "Perfect. Keep digging. I want every detail." "There's more," Richard added. "He's got a girlfriend, a serious one. Lives out in Jersey. She has no idea about Emily or any of his other affairs. From what I've seen, he's juggling multiple women while maintaining this image of a successful businessman." James couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "So, he's not just a cheater, he's a liar on every front." "Typical." Richard continued. "I've also got his daily routines mapped out. He frequents this upscale bar downtown called the Velvet Lounge. It's his go-to spot for entertaining women. Might be a good place to catch him in the act if you're planning anything." "I am," James said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Thanks, Rich. Keep me posted if you find anything else." Armed with Richard's intel, James decided it was time to take the first step in his plan. He couldn't let Alex continue his games unchecked, and he certainly couldn't let Emily think she'd gotten away with her deceit. It was time to set the wheels in motion. That Friday night, James dressed in a sharp black suit and headed to the Velvet Lounge. The bar was every bit as pretentious as Richard had described, dimly lit, with leather booths and a clientele that reeked of money and arrogance. James scanned the room, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Alex sitting in a corner booth with a woman who wasn't Emily. She was younger, blonde, and draped over Alex like a trophy. James didn't approach right away. Instead, he ordered a drink and positioned himself at the bar, watching the interaction unfold. Alex's charm was evident, but it was also shallow. The way he leaned in close, touched the woman's arm, and whispered in her ear was calculated, almost mechanical. It wasn't love or even genuine attraction, it was a performance. As the night wore on, James's anger simmered, but he kept it in check. He wasn't here to make a scene, not yet. He needed to gather evidence and set the stage for something much bigger. The next day, James compiled everything he had: Richard's findings, the photos from Emily's phone, and the notes he'd taken from observing Alex at the Velvet Lounge. He laid it all out on his desk, each piece fitting together like a puzzle. The more he looked at it, the clearer his path became. First, he would expose Alex for the fraud he was. James had connections in the city, journalists, lawyers, and even a few politicians. He would leak Alex's shady dealings to the press, ensuring his reputation took a hit he couldn't recover from. Next, he would contact Alex's girlfriend in Jersey. She deserved to know the truth about the man she was dating, and James had no qualms about being the one to tell her. He would make sure she had all the evidence she needed to cut ties with Alex permanently. Finally, he would confront Emily one last time. But this time he wouldn't be asking questions or seeking explanations. He would lay everything out in front of her: her lies, her betrayal, and the destruction she had brought to their marriage. And then he would walk away, leaving her to deal with the fallout of her actions. That evening, James sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. He had drafted an email to one of his journalist contacts, attaching all the documents Richard had uncovered about Alex's fraudulent deals. His finger hovered over the send button, and for a moment he hesitated. This was it, the point of no return. But then he thought about everything Alex and Emily had taken from him. His trust, his dignity, and the life he had worked so hard to build. They had made their choices, and now it was his turn. He pressed send. As James leaned back in his chair, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in weeks. The first strike had been delivered, but the war was far from over. He wasn't just fighting for revenge, he was fighting to reclaim his life. And by the time he was done, Alex and Emily would realize just how badly they had underestimated him. James had never been a man to shy away from confrontation, and this time he was preparing for a battle unlike any he had faced before. The betrayal that Emily and Alex had crafted behind his back would not go unanswered. Tonight he would expose the truth, not just to them but to everyone who needed to see their lies laid bare. The living room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the adjoining kitchen. James sat on the couch, a folder of documents in one hand and his phone in the other. On the screen was the video he'd compiled, a collection of photos, text messages, and surveillance footage that left no doubt about the affair. Each image and clip painted a vivid picture of Emily's deceit and Alex's audacity. It was raw, undeniable evidence, and tonight it would serve as the weapon James wielded to reclaim his dignity. He had invited Emily to dinner that evening under the pretense of wanting to talk about their marriage. She had hesitated, perhaps sensing the undercurrent of tension, but eventually agreed. James had also arranged for a few key witnesses to join them: Karen, their neighbor who had seen too much, and Richard, the private investigator who had unearthed Alex's dirty secrets. This wouldn't just be a confrontation, it would be a trial. As the clock struck 7, the doorbell rang. James stood, his jaw set, and opened the door to find Emily standing there, dressed impeccably as always. Her smile faltered slightly when she saw his serious expression. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Come in," James said curtly, stepping aside to let her enter. His voice carried none of the warmth it once had. Emily glanced around the room, her eyes narrowing when she noticed Karen and Richard seated at the dining table. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. "You'll see," James said, closing the door behind her. Dinner was a tense affair. James barely touched his food, his eyes fixed on Emily as she made polite conversation with Karen and Richard. She was putting on a show, pretending everything was fine, but James could see the cracks in her facade. She was nervous, and rightly so. When the plates were cleared and the wine glasses refilled, James finally spoke. "Emily," he began, his tone measured but firm. "There's something I need to show you." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" James reached for his phone, connecting it to the television. The screen flickered to life, displaying the first image of Emily and Alex together. A grainy photo of them leaving the Velvet Lounge, her arm linked with his. Emily's face went pale. "James, what is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "This," James said, gesturing to the screen, "is the truth. The truth you've been hiding from me for months." He pressed play and the video began. Messages scrolled across the screen, filled with flirtatious exchanges and plans to meet. Surveillance footage showed Alex's black BMW parked near their house, Emily climbing into the passenger seat. The final clip was of Alex at the Velvet Lounge, cozying up to another woman, proof that Emily wasn't even his only affair. Emily's hands trembled as she watched, her eyes darting to Karen and Richard, who sat in silence, their expressions grim. "James, I can explain." "Don't," James interrupted, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I don't want to hear your excuses. This isn't just about you sneaking around behind my back. This is about the lies, the betrayal, and the complete disregard you've shown for our marriage." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but James didn't waver. He had prepared for this moment, steeling himself against any emotional manipulation. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he continued. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the life we built together, the trust we shared, and for what? A man who's nothing more than a fraud?" Emily's head snapped up. "What are you talking about?" James smirked, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You really think Alex is some charming, successful businessman? Let me enlighten you." He nodded at Richard, who slid a folder across the table toward Emily. "Go ahead. Take a look." Emily hesitated before opening the folder. Her face fell as she read the contents, evidence of Alex's fraudulent deals, his lawsuits, and his long list of conquests. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Of course you didn't," James said coldly. "You were too busy falling for his lies to see him for what he really is." Karen, who had remained quiet until now, spoke up. "Emily, we all make mistakes, but this is beyond a mistake. You've hurt James in ways you can't even begin to understand." Emily's tears spilled over, but James wasn't moved. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You made your choices, Emily. Now you're going to face the consequences." The room fell silent as James disconnected his phone from the television and stood. He walked to the kitchen, returning with an envelope. "This," he said, tossing it onto the table, "is a copy of everything we just saw. It's also going to Alex's girlfriend in Jersey. She deserves to know the kind of man she's been dating." Emily's eyes widened in horror. "James, no. Please, don't drag her into this." "Why not?" James shot back. "She's as much a victim of his lies as I am of yours." He turned to Richard. "I want you to make sure Alex gets a copy too. Let him know he's not untouchable." Richard nodded. "Consider it done." Emily reached for James's arm, but he pulled away. "Don't," he said sharply. "You don't get to play the victim here. You did this. You made these choices, and now you're going to live with them." She sobbed, burying her face in her hands, but James felt no sympathy. His heart ached, yes, but it wasn't for her. It was for the man he had been before all of this, for the trust and love that had been shattered beyond repair. As James gathered the evidence and placed it back in the folder, he felt a sense of closure beginning to take root. Emily's betrayal had cut deep, but he wasn't a man who let wounds fester. He was taking control of his life, and this was just the beginning. The next step was Alex, and James was ready to deliver the blow that would shatter his carefully constructed facade. The game was far from over, and James was determined to emerge victorious. James wasn't done yet. The storm he had unleashed in his living room was only the beginning. He knew Emily was shaken, but Alex, the man who had dared to invade his marriage, still had no idea what was coming for him. And James was determined to ensure that Alex's fall would be as spectacular as his arrogance. The first step in dismantling Alex's world was understanding how deep his schemes ran. James spent the next few days delving into the information Richard had provided. The details were damning. Alex had built his wealth on a foundation of deceit, using underhanded tactics to manipulate real estate deals and defraud investors. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a criminal. James decided that simply exposing Alex's affair wasn't enough. Men like Alex thrived on their egos, their public images carefully crafted to exude power and success. Destroying that image was the key to taking him down. But James wasn't just going to destroy Alex's reputation. He was going to make sure the man lost everything he valued. One evening, James received an email from Richard with more explosive details. Among the evidence was a series of encrypted emails that Richard had managed to decode. The messages revealed that Alex had been blackmailing a former business associate, threatening to expose the man's involvement in a shady land acquisition unless he paid Alex a significant sum. Got him, James muttered, a grim smile spreading across his face. This was the kind of leverage he needed. Not only did it show Alex's true nature, but it also gave James a way to turn the tables. He called Richard immediately. I need this forwarded to the authorities, James said. Make sure it's anonymous, but ensure it gets their attention. Richard chuckled on the other end of the line. You're not holding back, are you? Why should I? James replied. This guy thought he could walk into my life and destroy it. Now I'm going to destroy his. With the authorities now aware of Alex's illegal activities, James turned his attention to the next phase of his plan: public humiliation. He knew Alex was scheduled to attend a high-profile real estate gala in Manhattan the following week, a perfect opportunity to expose him in front of his peers. James spent hours crafting a presentation. Using the evidence he had gathered, he created a visual masterpiece that detailed Alex's fraudulent deals, his blackmail schemes, and even his affairs. Each slide was meticulously designed to hit harder than the last. By the time James finished, he knew he had a weapon that would obliterate Alex's reputation. The night of the gala arrived and James was ready. Dressed in a sleek black suit, he walked into the grand ballroom with a calm confidence that belied the storm he was about to unleash. The room was filled with New York's elite, the air buzzing with the hum of conversation and clinking glasses. James spotted Alex near the bar, holding court as usual. He was laughing, his arm draped casually over the shoulder of yet another woman, neither Emily nor his girlfriend from Jersey. James's lip curled in disgust. Alex was a predator, and it was time to put an end to his games. As the evening progressed, James waited for the perfect moment. When the host took the stage to introduce the keynote speaker, James made his move. He approached the tech team managing the audiovisual setup and handed them a USB drive. This needs to be played next, he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. The technician hesitated. Sir, we're following a schedule. This is more important, James interrupted, his voice icy. Trust me. The technician must have sensed the gravity of the situation because he nodded and inserted the drive. Moments later, the screen behind the stage lit up, displaying the first slide of James's presentation. The room fell silent as the guests turned their attention to the screen. What followed was a takedown unlike anything the crowd had ever witnessed. Slide after slide revealed the truth about Alex, his fraudulent deals, his blackmail schemes, and his affairs. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as the evidence piled up. Alex, who had been standing near the stage, froze, his confident demeanor crumbling with each passing second. Who the hell did this? He demanded, his voice rising in panic. James stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. I did, he said, his voice carrying across the room. You thought you could cheat, lie, and manipulate without consequences. But every action has a price, Alex. And tonight you're paying yours? Alex's face turned red with fury. You've got no proof. This is slander. James raised an eyebrow. No proof? You think the emails you sent, the surveillance footage, and the lawsuits are fake? The authorities already have everything they need to take you down. This isn't slander, Alex. It's justice. The room erupted into chaos. Some guests looked on in shock, others whispered to each other, and a few even began filming the scene on their phones. Alex's world was unraveling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As security escorted Alex out of the gala, James felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in weeks. But his work wasn't done yet. Emily was still part of the equation, and James knew he needed to confront her one last time. When James returned home that night, he found Emily waiting for him in the living room. Her eyes were red from crying, but James didn't feel the same sympathy he once might have. She had made her choices and now she had to face the consequences. You humiliated him, didn't you? She asked, her voice trembling. James didn't deny it. I exposed the truth. He deserved it. Emily shook her head. And what about me? Are you going to destroy me too? James stared at her, his expression unreadable. I don't need to destroy you, Emily. You've already done that to yourself. She sobbed, burying her face in her hands, but James didn't waver. He walked past her, his steps measured and deliberate. I'm filing for divorce, he said, his tone cold. And I'm keeping everything, the house, the assets, all of it. You can start over with nothing, just like I have to. Emily looked up, her face stricken. James, please? No, he said sharply. You don't get to beg for forgiveness. Not after what you've done. He left her there, walking upstairs to his office. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like himself again, strong, in control, and ready to rebuild his life. As James sat at his desk, he stared out the window at the city skyline. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Alex's schemes were exposed, Emily's betrayal was laid bare, and James was emerging from the wreckage stronger than ever. The next chapter of his life was just beginning, and he was determined to write it on his own terms. James was not the kind of man to forgive and forget. His wife's betrayal had carved a wound deep into his soul, but Alex's audacity had lit a fire that could not be extinguished. The destruction at the gala was only the first blow, a crack in Alex's empire. But James had no intention of stopping there. He wanted more than revenge. He wanted to dismantle Alex's entire existence, piece by piece. The next phase of James's plan required precision and boldness. He wasn't going to rely solely on public humiliation and legal trouble to bring Alex down. He wanted Alex to feel the weight of his decisions, to experience the suffocating fear of losing everything he had built. And James knew exactly where to start. One morning, James met with Richard in a secluded cafe downtown. Richard had brought another folder of evidence, this one containing details about Alex's business associates and personal finances. "I've been digging deeper," Richard said, sliding the folder across the table. "Turns out Alex isn't just crooked in business. He's got a habit of using his money to silence people. Bribes, hush money, you name it. But he's stretched thin. One big hit and his entire operation could collapse." James opened the folder, scanning the documents. Bank statements, transactions, and correspondence painted a clear picture of a man living on the edge. "This is perfect," James said, his mind racing with possibilities. "If we hit him where it hurts, financially, he'll have no way to recover." Richard leaned back, his expression serious. "You're playing with fire, James. Men like Alex don't go down quietly. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." James's gaze hardened. "I'm not afraid of him. He's the one who should be afraid." The first strike was simple yet devastating. Using the evidence Richard had provided, James anonymously tipped off Alex's bank about suspicious activities in his accounts. Within days, several of Alex's accounts were frozen, cutting off his access to funds. Without money, Alex's ability to bribe and manipulate his way out of trouble was significantly weakened. Next, James targeted Alex's business relationships. Posing as a potential investor, James set up a meeting with one of Alex's key partners, a man named Daniel Grayson. Daniel was a shrewd businessman, but he had little patience for dishonesty. Armed with evidence of Alex's fraudulent deals, James presented his case in a way that left no room for doubt. "I'm not here to destroy your business," James said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm here to warn you. Staying in bed with Alex could cost you everything. Cut ties with him now, and you might have a chance to salvage your reputation." Daniel studied the documents James had laid out before him, his expression grim. "If what you're saying is true, Alex is finished?" "He is," James said. "But how you handle this will determine whether you go down with him or come out clean." By the end of the meeting, Daniel had agreed to sever all ties with Alex. The fallout was immediate. Alex's business began to crumble as word spread about his unethical practices. One by one, his partners and clients abandoned him, unwilling to risk their own reputations by association. But James wasn't done yet. He knew Alex's ego wouldn't allow him to go down without a fight, and he was prepared for the retaliation. True to form, Alex struck back, hiring a team of lawyers to discredit the evidence against him and filing a defamation lawsuit against James. James met with his own legal team, unfazed by Alex's aggression. "Let him come," he said, his voice cold and determined. "I've got more than enough to bury him." The courtroom showdown was intense, a battle of wills between two men who refused to back down. Alex's lawyers tried to paint James as a bitter, vengeful husband, but James countered with facts, presenting irrefutable evidence of Alex's crimes. By the time the trial ended, Alex's case had fallen apart, and the judge dismissed the lawsuit with prejudice. As Alex's legal troubles mounted, James decided it was time to deliver the final blow. He arranged for a meeting with Alex at a neutral location, a private office space rented for the occasion. Alex arrived, his confidence shaken but not entirely broken. "What do you want?" Alex demanded as he entered the room. His suit was rumpled, his tie askew, a far cry from the polished image he usually projected. James stood by the window, his back to Alex. He didn't turn around as he spoke. "I want you to understand what it feels like to lose everything." Alex scoffed. "You think you've won? You're nothing but a bitter man clinging to scraps of dignity." James turned, his gaze cold and unflinching. "And you're a coward who hides behind lies and manipulation. But that ends now." He stepped forward, placing a folder on the table between them. "This is everything I've got on you. The fraud, the blackmail, the affairs. It's already with the authorities, but I thought you deserved to see just how thoroughly you've been exposed." Alex flipped through the folder, his face paling with each page. "You son of a—" "Don't bother," James interrupted. "You've lost. Your accounts are frozen, your partners have abandoned you, and your reputation is in tatters. You're done, Alex." Alex slammed the folder shut, his hands trembling with rage. "You think this is over? I'll find a way to come back." "Oh. No, you won't," James said, cutting him off. "Because I'll be watching. And the moment you try to pull another stunt, I'll make sure you face consequences even worse than this." The confrontation ended with Alex storming out, defeated and humiliated. James watched him go, a sense of closure washing over him. It wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about justice, about reclaiming his life and proving that no one could take him down. As James left the office, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Alex's schemes were dismantled, and his arrogance had been crushed. The battle was over, but James knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter. He had faced betrayal and emerged stronger, a man unbroken by the trials he had endured. And now it was time to rebuild, not just his life but himself. James had delivered devastating blows to Alex's empire, but his work was far from done. The exposure of Alex's crimes and public humiliation had shaken the man's confidence, but James knew men like Alex were dangerous when cornered. He expected retaliation, and he was ready for it. The tension reached its peak one evening when James received an anonymous email. The subject line read, "You've gone too far." Attached was a video of James walking into his office and reviewing documents. The implication was clear. Alex had been watching him. The email warned him to back off or face consequences. James leaned back in his chair, the glow of the computer screen illuminating his face. His jaw tightened and his fingers drummed against the desk. A lesser man might have been intimidated, but James wasn't a man who bowed to threats. Instead, he saw the email for what it was, a desperate attempt by Alex to regain control. He forwarded the email to Richard with a single line, "Find out who sent this." The next morning, Richard called with an update. It came from an IP address tied to one of Alex's shell companies. "He's trying to rattle you." "Let him try," James said, his voice cold. "If he thinks I'm backing down, he's mistaken." James knew the game was escalating, and he wasn't about to let Alex have the upper hand. He decided to go on the offensive, digging deeper into Alex's connections. It didn't take long for James to discover that Alex wasn't just involved in fraudulent real estate deals, he was also laundering money for a local criminal syndicate. The revelation was a turning point. Alex wasn't just a manipulative liar. He was a dangerous man entangled in illegal activities far more serious than James had anticipated. But instead of backing off, James saw an opportunity to strike a final, crippling blow. Later that day, James met with Richard in a discreet location. The evidence they had uncovered was staggering: bank transfers, coded messages, and transactions linking Alex to the syndicate. It was a goldmine of information, and James planned to use it to its fullest potential. "We need to be smart about this," Richard said, spreading the documents across the table. "If we push too hard, Alex might retaliate in ways we can't control." James's eyes narrowed. "I'm not afraid of him. He's already crossed every line. It's time to end this." Richard nodded reluctantly. "What's the plan?" "We leak this to the authorities," James said. "But we do it strategically. We make sure it gets into the hands of someone who won't hesitate to act." That night, James prepared a dossier containing all the evidence against Alex. He mailed it anonymously to a contact within the FBI, someone he knew wouldn't let the information gather dust. Once the package was sent, James felt a sense of anticipation. He knew the walls were closing in on Alex, and it was only a matter of time before the man was brought to justice. The fallout began within days. Federal agents raided Alex's office, seizing computers and documents. News outlets reported on the investigation, painting Alex as the mastermind behind a web of corruption and crime. James watched the coverage with grim satisfaction, knowing his efforts had set the wheels in motion. But Alex wasn't finished yet. As his world crumbled around him, he made a desperate attempt to salvage what little power he had left. He sent men to intimidate James, breaking into his office late at night and leaving behind a chilling message: "This isn't over." When James arrived the next morning and saw the damage, he didn't flinch. Instead, he called the police and filed a report, making it clear he wasn't afraid to fight back. He also installed additional security measures, ensuring his home and office were impenetrable. Alex's attempts to intimidate him only strengthened his resolve. A week later, James received a call from Richard. "Alex is spiraling," Richard said. "The syndicates turned on him. They think he's a liability now that the FBI is involved." James felt a spark of satisfaction. Good. Let them deal with him. But Richard's tone grew serious. "There's something else. Alex knows it was you who tipped off the authorities. He's desperate, and desperate men are unpredictable." James wasn't surprised. He had expected Alex to figure it out eventually, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. "Let him come," James said. "I'm ready." The final confrontation came sooner than James expected. One evening, as he worked late in his office, the lights flickered and the security alarm blared. James reached for the baseball bat he kept by his desk, his senses on high alert. He wasn't about to be caught off guard. Moments later, the door burst open and Alex stepped inside, his face twisted with rage. He held a gun, but his hand shook, a clear sign of his unraveling mental state. "This ends now, James," Alex shouted, his voice trembling. "You think you can ruin me and walk away?" James didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his expression calm but unyielding. "You ruined yourself, Alex. I just gave you the push you deserved." Alex sneered, raising the gun. "You've taken everything from me. My business, my reputation, my life. Why shouldn't I take yours?" James took a step forward, his voice steady. "Because you're a coward. You've spent your entire life hiding behind lies and manipulation. But now, everyone knows who you really are. And no matter what you do to me, you can't change that." For a moment, Alex hesitated. The weight of James's words seemed to sink in, and his grip on the gun faltered. But then, with a roar of anger, he lunged forward. James was ready. He swung the bat with all his strength, knocking the gun from Alex's hand. The weapon skittered across the floor, and James followed up with a powerful shove that sent Alex sprawling. "You're done, Alex," James said, standing over him. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." Before Alex could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. James had triggered a silent alarm, and the police arrived just in time to arrest Alex. As the officers hauled him away, James felt a sense of closure. The battle was finally over. James watched as Alex was driven away in the back of a police car, his face a mix of anger and defeat. The man who had tried to destroy him was now facing the consequences of his actions, and James knew he had won. But this wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. James had reclaimed his life, his dignity, and his strength. And as he stood in the quiet of his office, he realized he was ready to start again, stronger than ever. The morning air was heavy with tension as James prepared for the last chapter in his battle against Alex and Emily's betrayal. The weight of everything he had endured sat squarely on his shoulders, but it didn't weaken him. It sharpened his focus, solidified his resolve. Today wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. James had been summoned to court as a key witness in Alex's ongoing criminal investigation. The charges against Alex were staggering: fraud, money laundering, blackmail, and now attempted assault thanks to the previous night's break-in. James had meticulously ensured that the authorities had every piece of evidence they needed to take Alex down. This trial wasn't just a legal formality, it was a reckoning. Walking into the courthouse, James exuded a quiet confidence. He wore a tailored suit, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't here to gloat, he was here to see justice served. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people recognized him. The man who had taken on a powerful figure like Alex and one was a subject of both admiration and curiosity. As James entered the courtroom, his eyes locked onto Alex. Gone was the smug, arrogant man who had once walked around as if untouchable. Alex's suit was wrinkled, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The man had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, and James couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Emily was there too, seated near the back of the room. Her face was tear-streaked, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. James barely spared her a glance. She had made her choices, and now she was just another witness to Alex's downfall. The proceedings began with the prosecutor laying out the charges against Alex, each one backed by irrefutable evidence. Bank records, emails, witness testimonies. James had made sure it all connected. The prosecutor didn't just paint Alex as a criminal. They painted him as a manipulative, deceitful predator who used people for his gain. James's turn to testify came, and as he took the stand, the room fell silent. He recounted everything: the discovery of the affair, the evidence he had uncovered, and Alex's desperate attempts to retaliate. His words were calm, measured, but each one carried the weight of truth. Alex thought he could take whatever he wanted, James said, his voice steady. He thought people like me wouldn't fight back. But he underestimated what a man can do when he's been pushed too far. Alex's defense attorney tried to discredit James, accusing him of seeking revenge out of personal spite. But James didn't waver. He met each accusation with facts, each question with a pointed answer. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the defense's case was in shambles. The climax of the trial came when the prosecutor unveiled the final piece of evidence: a recording of Alex admitting to his crimes during a private conversation. The audio had been obtained legally through a whistleblower who had worked closely with Alex. As the recording played, Alex's face turned ashen. There was no denying it now: his empire was built on lies and it was crumbling around him. The judge's verdict was swift and unforgiving. Alex was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to decades in prison. As the gavel struck, sealing Alex's fate, James felt a surge of relief. Justice had been served. But James wasn't done yet. After the trial, he approached Emily, who was waiting for him outside the courthouse. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything." "Save it," James said sharply, cutting her off. "Your apologies mean nothing to me. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself. You destroyed everything we had for a man who didn't even care about you." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but James didn't soften. He had spent too much time feeling the weight of her choices, and he wasn't about to let her drag him down again. "I'm moving on, Emily," he continued. "You should too. But don't expect me to forgive you. Some things can't be undone." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, a picture of regret and sorrow. Later that evening, James returned home. The house felt different now, quieter, more peaceful. He sat by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in hand, and let the events of the day sink in. Alex was behind bars, Emily was out of his life, and he was finally free to rebuild. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to relax. He wasn't a man who needed revenge to feel whole, but the justice he had achieved gave him the closure he needed. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and danger, but he had come out stronger on the other side. As the fire crackled, James thought about the future. He had a chance to start over, to create a new life on his terms. And this time he wouldn't let anyone take it away from him. The next day, James visited the law firm handling his divorce. He signed the final papers with a steady hand, feeling the weight of his old life lift with each signature. "It's official," the lawyer said, handing him a copy. "You're free." Free. The word resonated deeply within him. For the first time in months, James felt like himself again. He had faced his darkest days and emerged stronger, more focused. He wasn't just a man who had survived betrayal. He was a man who had thrived in its aftermath. That evening, James took a walk through the city. The hustle and bustle of New York felt different now, less overwhelming and more invigorating. He stopped at a small park, watching as the city lights reflected off the water. It was a reminder that life moved forward no matter what. James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He paused on Richard's name before hitting call. "Hey James," Richard answered. "How are you holding up?" "I'm good," James said, and for the first time he meant it. "Listen, I've been thinking. You've got a lot of connections and I've got some ideas. Let's grab a drink and talk about what's next." Richard chuckled. "You're not slowing down, are you?" "Not a chance," James replied. As he ended the call, James felt a spark of excitement. The battle was over, but his life was just beginning. There were new challenges to face, new opportunities to seize, and James was ready for all of it. James raised his glass, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. The battle was over and he had won, not just against Alex and Emily, but against the doubt and pain that had threatened to consume him. He was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. This was his new beginning and he was determined to make it count. The morning air was heavy with tension as James prepared for the last chapter in his battle against Alex and Emily's betrayal. The weight of everything he had endured sat squarely on his shoulders, but it didn't weaken him. It sharpened his focus, solidified his resolve. Today wasn't about revenge, it was about closure. James had been summoned to court as a key witness in Alex's ongoing criminal investigation. The charges against Alex were staggering: fraud, money laundering, blackmail, and now attempted assault thanks to the previous night's break-in. James had meticulously ensured that the authorities had every piece of evidence they needed to take Alex down. This trial wasn't just a legal formality, it was a reckoning. Walking into the courthouse, James exuded a quiet confidence. He wore a tailored suit, his posture straight, his gaze unwavering. He wasn't here to gloat, he was here to see justice served. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people recognized him. The man who had taken on a powerful figure like Alex and one was a subject of both admiration and curiosity. As James entered the courtroom, his eyes locked onto Alex. Gone was the smug, arrogant man who had once walked around as if untouchable. Alex's suit was wrinkled, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The man had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, and James couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Emily was there too, seated near the back of the room. Her face was tear-streaked, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. James barely spared her a glance. She had made her choices, and now she was just another witness to Alex's downfall. The proceedings began with the prosecutor laying out the charges against Alex, each one backed by irrefutable evidence. Bank records, emails, witness testimonies, James had made sure it all connected. The prosecutor didn't just paint Alex as a criminal, they painted him as a manipulative, deceitful predator who used people for his gain. James's turn to testify came, and as he took the stand, the room fell silent. He recounted everything: the discovery of the affair, the evidence he had uncovered, and Alex's desperate attempts to retaliate. His words were calm, measured, but each one carried the weight of truth. Alex thought he could take whatever he wanted, James said, his voice steady. He thought people like me wouldn't fight back. But he underestimated what a man can do when he's been pushed too far. Alex's defense attorney tried to discredit James, accusing him of seeking revenge out of personal spite. But James didn't waver. He met each accusation with facts, each question with a pointed answer. By the time he stepped down from the stand, the defense's case was in shambles. The climax of the trial came when the prosecutor unveiled the final piece of evidence: a recording of Alex admitting to his crimes during a private conversation. The audio had been obtained legally through a whistleblower who had worked closely with Alex. As the recording played, Alex's face turned ashen. There was no denying it now, his empire was built on lies and it was crumbling around him. The judge's verdict was swift and unforgiving. Alex was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to decades in prison. As the gavel struck, sealing Alex's fate, James felt a surge of relief. Justice had been served. But James wasn't done yet. After the trial, he approached Emily, who was waiting for him outside the courthouse. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with regret. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry for everything." "Save it," James said sharply, cutting her off. "Your apologies mean nothing to me. You didn't just betray me, you betrayed yourself. You destroyed everything we had for a man who didn't even care about you." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but James didn't soften. He had spent too much time feeling the weight of her choices, and he wasn't about to let her drag him down again. "I'm moving on, Emily," he continued. "You should too. But don't expect me to forgive you. Some things can't be undone." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, a picture of regret and sorrow. Later that evening, James returned home. The house felt different now, quieter, more peaceful. He sat by the fireplace, a glass of bourbon in hand, and let the events of the day sink in. Alex was behind bars, Emily was out of his life, and he was finally free to rebuild. For the first time in weeks, James allowed himself to relax. He wasn't a man who needed revenge to feel whole, but the justice he had achieved gave him the closure he needed. He had faced betrayal, humiliation, and danger, but he had come out stronger on the other side. As the fire crackled, James thought about the future. He had a chance to start over, to create a new life on his terms. And this time he wouldn't let anyone take it away from him. The next day, James visited the law firm handling his divorce. He signed the final papers with a steady hand, feeling the weight of his old life lift with each signature. "It's official," the lawyer said, handing him a copy. "You're free." Free. The word resonated deeply within him. For the first time in months, James felt like himself again. He had faced his darkest days and emerged stronger, more focused. He wasn't just a man who had survived betrayal. He was a man who had thrived in its aftermath. That evening, James took a walk through the city. The hustle and bustle of New York felt different now, less overwhelming and more invigorating. He stopped at a small park, watching as the city lights reflected off the water. It was a reminder that life moved forward no matter what. James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He paused on Richard's name before hitting call. "Hey James," Richard answered. "How are you holding up?" "I'm good," James said, and for the first time he meant it. "Listen, I've been thinking. You've got a lot of connections and I've got some ideas. Let's grab a drink and talk about what's next." Richard chuckled. "You're not slowing down, are you?" "Not a chance," James replied. As he ended the call, James felt a spark of excitement. The battle was over, but his life was just beginning. There were new challenges to face, new opportunities to seize, and James was ready for all of it. James raised his glass, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. The battle was over, and he had won, not just against Alex and Emily, but against the doubt and pain that had threatened to consume him. He was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. This was his new beginning, and he was determined to make it count. The city buzzed with life as James stepped into the warm glow of the morning sun. The air carried a sense of renewal, as though the universe itself acknowledged the end of his long and grueling battle. For James, it wasn't just the beginning of a new day, it was the beginning of a new chapter. James started his morning with a ritual he hadn't indulged in for years, sitting by the window of his favorite cafe, sipping black coffee while reading the news. The headlines confirmed the aftermath of his efforts. Alex, the man who had arrogantly thought he was untouchable, was now a disgraced figure facing the full weight of the law. Fraud charges, criminal dealings, and years of manipulation had caught up with him. The story dominated the media, with commentators labeling it one of the most spectacular falls from grace in recent history. James folded the newspaper and leaned back, a small smile playing on his lips. The sense of closure he had long sought had finally taken root. The battle had cost him dearly, but he had emerged stronger, more resolute. Alex was behind bars, and Emily was no longer a ghost haunting his thoughts. He was free not just legally but emotionally. The remainder of the morning was spent tying up loose ends. James had hired a real estate agent to sell the house he had once shared with Emily. It was a place filled with memories, some good, some painful. But James knew he couldn't start anew while surrounded by the remnants of his old life. As he walked through the empty rooms, he felt no sadness. Instead, he saw opportunity, a chance to leave the past behind and move forward without hesitation. While packing the last of his belongings, James came across an old photo album. He flipped through the pages, pausing on pictures of happier times with Emily. For a moment, a pang of regret tugged at his heart, but it quickly passed. Those moments were gone, and dwelling on them wouldn't change what had happened. He closed the album and placed it in the box, a symbol of his decision to acknowledge the past without letting it define him. James's phone buzzed with a message from the real estate agent. "The buyers have confirmed the closing date. Congratulations, Mr. Walker." James replied with a brief thank you, and leaned against the wall, feeling the finality of the decision settling in. It wasn't just a house, it was the last vestige of a life that no longer served him. That evening, James hosted a small gathering with close friends. Richard was the first to arrive, carrying a bottle of bourbon and a knowing smile. "You've been through hell, James," he said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "But look at you now." James laughed, pouring them both a drink. "It feels good to finally breathe again." As the evening progressed, the conversation turned to the future. James shared his plans to travel, to explore opportunities he had put on hold for years. "I want to build something new," he said. "Something that's mine, untouched by the chaos of the past." Richard nodded. "You've got the drive for it. Whatever you do next, it's going to be incredible." Another friend, Claire, chimed in. "You've inspired all of us, James. Watching you take back control of your life has been amazing. It's a reminder that no matter how bad things get, there's always a way forward." James raised his glass, a small smile on his lips. "Here's to new beginnings." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. James finalized the sale of his house and moved into a sleek, modern apartment overlooking the city. The new space was a reflection of his renewed mindset, minimalistic, focused, and filled with potential. He spent his days planning his next steps, reconnecting with old friends and rediscovering the passions he had long neglected. One afternoon, while organizing his office, James came across a journal he had started years ago. Flipping through its pages, he saw entries filled with dreams and aspirations, many of which had been left unfulfilled. Inspired, he picked up a pen and began writing again. The act felt cathartic, a way to process his journey and chart a course for the future. James's story began to inspire others. Word of his battle against Alex and his ability to overcome betrayal spread through his network. Colleagues and friends reached out, expressing admiration for his resilience. Some even sought his advice, asking how he had managed to navigate such a tumultuous time with strength and dignity. One such request came from a young entrepreneur named Claire, who had been defrauded by a business partner. She met James at a cafe, her expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I need your guidance," she said. "I want to fight back, but I don't know where to start." James listened intently, offering practical advice and sharing the lessons he had learned. By the end of their conversation, Claire's confidence had grown, and she thanked him profusely. "You're proof that it's possible to come out stronger," she said. For James, the interaction was a reminder of the power of resilience. He had turned his pain into strength, and now he was helping others do the same. One evening, James stood on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle like stars. The cool breeze carried a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He reflected on how far he had come, from the moment he discovered Emily's betrayal to the final courtroom confrontation with Alex. Every step had been a challenge, but each one had shaped him into the man he was today. As he sipped his bourbon, his phone buzzed with a message from Richard. It was a simple note: "Proud of you, brother. The best is yet to come." James smiled, setting the glass down. He knew Richard was right. The trials of the past had forged him into a stronger, wiser man. He wasn't defined by the betrayals or the battles he had fought. He was defined by his ability to rise above them. Ending hook. Standing on the balcony, James let out a deep breath and looked toward the horizon. As James's journey comes to a close, his story serves as a powerful reminder of resilience and transformation. What would you have done in James's shoes? Have you ever faced a betrayal or challenge that pushed you to rebuild and start anew? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know how you would rise above life's toughest trials. The world is filled with opportunities. How will you make your next chapter extraordinary? The world was vast, filled with possibilities he had yet to explore. He wasn't afraid of the unknown. In fact, he welcomed it. For the first time in years, James felt truly alive, ready to embrace whatever came next. His journey had been painful, but it had also been transformative. This was his new beginning, and he was determined to make it extraordinary.